When we first moved into the neighborhood, my wife and I thought we had found the perfect place to start fresh. The houses were well kept, the lawns were manicured, and the neighborhood had that quiet suburban charm people dream of. But hidden behind that picture-perfect exterior was something much darker, a homeowners association that thrived on control, intimidation, and fear. From the moment the moving truck pulled up, it was clear we had stepped into hostile territory. My wife, confident and strong-willed, carried herself with grace, but Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, saw her as an immediate threat. Karen was the kind of neighbor who stood at her window with binoculars, waiting for the smallest rule violation. To her, every action we took was a challenge to her authority. On the very first day, before the last box had even made it inside, Karen marched over with her HOA binder tucked under her arm. She didn't come with a welcoming smile or baked goods like normal neighbors would. Instead, she came with a list of rules, demands, and thinly veiled threats. The message was clear. This was her kingdom, and we were outsiders who needed to fall in line. But my wife wasn't the type to be intimidated. She had dealt with people like Karen before, those who used fake power to inflate their fragile egos. Instead of cowering, she stood tall, thanked Karen for her concerns, and went back to unpacking. That single act of defiance was enough to ignite a war. The next few days only fueled Karen's obsession. She complained about where our trash bins were placed, even though they were exactly within guidelines. She accused us of violating noise ordinances when all we were doing was unloading furniture. And then she escalated further. On the third day, as my wife stepped outside to water the plants she had just potted, Karen called 911. Yes, 911. She claimed my wife was trespassing on property she did not own, despite the fact that the deed with our names had been signed, sealed, and delivered. The flashing lights of the police car drew neighbors out of their homes, whispering, watching, and waiting to see what would unfold. Karen stood there smugly, convinced she had just scored a major victory. But what Karen didn't know was that my wife wasn't just any new homeowner. She was an attorney, one who specialized in real estate and property law. The very same legal framework Karen used as a weapon was something my wife had mastered as her career. While Karen thought she was about to humiliate us, she had actually handed my wife the perfect opportunity to expose her reign of terror. As the officers approached, my wife calmly explained the situation, showing them the closing documents and ownership papers. The officers realized quickly that this was nothing more than a petty neighbor dispute fueled by Karen's arrogance. They gave Karen a warning about abusing emergency services, but she brushed it off, believing she had won the neighborhood's attention. What Karen didn't realize was that those flashing lights had also drawn attention to her long history of harassment. Neighbors who had stayed silent out of fear now started whispering to each other. And while Karen smirked in the moment, convinced she had humiliated us, my wife was already preparing the ultimate counterstrike. Because just 20 minutes after the police left, Karen would be standing on her front lawn in shock, holding eviction papers that would flip her world upside down. But before we get there, the story of how this battle unfolded reveals just how far Karen had gone, and why my wife was uniquely positioned to end her HOA tyranny once and for all. When the police cars pulled away and the neighbors retreated into their homes, most assumed the drama had ended for the day. Karen certainly thought so. She stood on her porch with that smug grin she was known for, clutching her HOA binder like a trophy. In her mind, she had put the new couple in their place. But what she didn't realize was that my wife had quietly prepared for this exact scenario. Inside our home, my wife spread out a stack of legal documents across the dining table. Her years of experience in property law gave her a unique advantage. She knew how to fight back not with shouting, not with threats, but with paperwork that carried the weight of the courts behind it. Every unjust fine, every abusive action, every fabricated rule the HOA had enforced over the years, it could all be challenged. And Karen had a long, ugly track record of pushing her power too far. You see, Karen wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. She had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom. Residents had whispered about how she handed out citations for lawn decorations she didn't like, how she fined families for leaving bicycles outside for more than 5 minutes, and how she threatened elderly neighbors with foreclosure over missed dues. But because nobody wanted to deal with a legal headache, most people complied. They paid, they stayed quiet, and they let Karen's power grow unchecked. That silence ended the moment my wife moved in. With a calm, calculated efficiency, my wife drafted the paperwork. It wasn't just a complaint. It was a motion that directly challenged Karen's legitimacy as HOA president, citing numerous abuses of power and violations of state housing laws. And because my wife had discovered several cases where Karen had crossed into outright fraud, falsely reporting dues collections and misusing HOA funds, the motion also demanded her immediate removal. 20 minutes after Karen had called 911, a process server arrived at her front door. The knock echoed across the quiet street, and the sight of official documents being handed over to the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood drew curious eyes from every window. Karen's smirk faded the moment she saw the bold letters stamped on the front, notice of eviction proceedings and HOA leadership challenge. The color drained from her face. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, people were whispering on sidewalks, exchanging texts, and sharing the news at dinner tables. For years, Karen had ruled with intimidation, but now the tables had turned. Neighbors who had been silent victims began to see a glimmer of hope. If Karen could be taken down, maybe the neighborhood could finally breathe. Karen, however, was not one to go down without a fight. That night, she stormed into the HOA office, calling emergency meetings, trying to rally the board members to her side. She claimed we were outsiders trying to destroy the community, and spun wild stories about how we were plotting to bankrupt the neighborhood. But cracks were already forming in her support system. Even the board members who had once stood behind her were beginning to realize that my wife had the law on her side. What had started as a petty call to 911 had unleashed something Karen could no longer control. My wife had exposed the weak foundation beneath her empire, and it was beginning to crumble. Still, Karen wasn't done. In fact, the next step she took would make the battle even uglier and more public. Because when her power slipped through her fingers, she didn't just lash out at us. She turned her anger on the entire neighborhood. The days that followed were some of the most tense the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen, once feared and untouchable, was unraveling in plain sight. She fought back with everything she had, sending out mass emails, knocking on doors, and even trying to rally support by painting herself as the victim. But her desperate attempts only made her look weaker. The more she tried to cling to power, the more the community saw her for what she really was. Meanwhile, my wife moved methodically. She filed motions, gathered testimonies from neighbors who had long suffered under Karen's reign, and presented evidence of financial mismanagement that could not be ignored. Every unfair fine, every fabricated rule, every threatening letter Karen had sent, it was all laid out in black and white. The very documents Karen once used to intimidate others now became the weapons that dismantled her authority. When the court date arrived, the turnout was staggering. Neighbors who had been silent for years filled the room, ready to testify against the woman who had tormented them. For once, Karen couldn't hide behind her clipboard or her HOA binder. She stood alone, exposed, and powerless in front of the very people she had ruled over. The judge didn't need long to make a decision. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen was officially removed from her position, barred from any further HOA involvement, and ordered to pay restitution for misused funds. But the most shocking blow came when the court upheld the eviction proceedings against her. The house she had used as the center of her kingdom was no longer hers to control. Neighbors watched from their windows as Karen packed her belongings in silence. The woman who once called the police on my wife for watering plants was now forced to leave the neighborhood she had tried to dominate. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The streets felt calmer. And the people felt free. As for us, we didn't move into the neighborhood to start a war. But sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to protect yourself and those around you. My wife didn't just defend our home. She gave the entire community their peace back. And that's where this story ends. But what do you think? Was the HOA right to give Karen so much unchecked power in the first place? Or was this outcome the justice she truly deserved? Share your thoughts, because this is one HOA story that shows just how far things can spiral when the wrong person is given control.